The villagers had already carved the word monster into her door. Isra, the orc girl they'd tolerated for years, now blamed for every child who'd vanished from St. Aldrich's orphanage. But on the night the mob sharpened their pitchforks, a farmer named Henrik watched her stumble through the rain, clutching a wounded girl. Not as a kidnapper, but as the only one who'd ever tried to save them. 6 children. That was how many had vanished from St. Aldrich's orphanage in the village of Dunmire over 5 months. And every finger pointed toward the wooded hill on the edge of town, where an orc girl named Isra had lived alone for 3 winters. She was big, she was quiet, she was other. That was all the frightened villagers needed. But what no one saw, except a farmer named Henrik Karlström, was the truth hiding behind the orphanage's locked doors. A truth that wasn't monstrous, just monstrously inconvenient. To understand what he witnessed in the rain that night, you have to go back to the very first child who never came back. The first child to vanish was a boy named Willem, age 9, who disappeared on a night when the moon was thin as a paring knife, and the orphanage doors were locked from the inside. His shoes were still under his cot. His nightclothes were still folded at the foot. The orphanage master, a man named Alderman Thane, told the constable that Willem had been moody for weeks, that he'd spoken of running away to the high country. No one questioned this. Thane was a large man with a slow voice, and a face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of patient disappointment. The kind of face that made villagers nod when he spoke of duty and discipline and the burden of caring for children nobody else wanted. He came to Dunmire 5 years earlier with impeccable references from a parish in the northern diocese. He arrived with a cart of vestments and rule books and a letter from a bishop who described him as a man of firm moral character. Firm was the word they'd chosen. Later, much later, people would recall that Thane had spoken frequently about the orc girl on the hill, the way she watched the town, the way she moved along the tree line at dusk. He had not, they would realize, spoken about any other possible danger. He had given them one target, and he had polished it every day like a brass rail. Isra had arrived in Dunmire 3 winters prior, walking out of the northern forest with nothing but a pack and a walking staff, and a scar that ran from her temple to the corner of her mouth. The kind of scar that told a story she never offered to share. She was tall even by orc standards, broad-shouldered, with tusks small enough to suggest she was barely past adolescence, and eyes that were the color of old copper. She found the abandoned woodcutter's hut on the hill overlooking town, and she simply stayed. The villagers tolerated her because she caused no trouble, and because her presence meant that wolves from the deep wood stayed further back, and also because she had once helped old Gammer Elspeth carry a cord of wet firewood up the mill road without asking for payment. But tolerance is not acceptance, and acceptance is not safety. When Willem disappeared, the first whispers began. A child doesn't vanish from a locked room, people said. A child is taken, and who among us takes? The orc, the monster on the hill. Henrik Karlström farmed half a league south of Isra's hill, a strip of barley and root vegetables that he'd inherited from his father and his father before him. Henrik was not a man who spoke much in council meetings. He was 43, with a wife named Mari, who died of the coughing sickness 6 years ago, and a dog named Barrow, and a habit of standing at the edge of crowds. He had watched Isra more than most, not out of suspicion, but out of the particular curiosity of a man who could read weather patterns and soil composition and animal tracks, and recognized another being who moved through the world with deliberate, unadvertised competence. He'd seen her leave a bundle of bread wrapped in oilcloth at the orphanage fence one night after dark. then vanish into the tree line. He'd seen her pause to refasten the gate on old Milan's goat pen when the latch broke. Small things. Correct things. And then 3 more children disappeared. A girl named Tessa, 2 brothers, Lynn and Pell, all of them orphans, all of them wards of street. Aldrichs all vanished without a scream, without a broken window, without a footprint in the mud. Thane addressed the village after the 3rd disappearance, standing on the parish steps, with his hands folded like a steeple. "Evil has taken root among us," he said, "and we have allowed it to live while our innocents pay the price." He did not say Isra's name. He did not need to. The crowd turned toward the hill. Henrik stayed at the edge. 4 days later, a 5th child was gone. The mob painted the word "monster" in pig's blood across Isra's door. Isra retreated into her hut and did not come out for 48 hours. Henrik noticed that no one asked whether the orphanage doors had been locked. They'd been locked every time. Every time, Thane had the only key. But that detail, like so many others, sat unspoken at the edge of a crowd that was too afraid to do anything with it. Then the 6th child, Marta, 8 years old, vanished on the night of the worst storm Dunmire had seen in a decade. Thunder splitting the sky like hammered copper. Rain so heavy the Mill Creek jumped its banks. The village stayed indoors. No one expected a search party until morning. But Henrik, standing at his window with a mug of cold tea, saw something move along the tree line at the base of the hill. A shape. Large, dark, carrying a burden. He pulled on his oil cloak and went out. He was a farmer, not a constable, not a hero. But his wife Marie had once told him that the difference between a man who stands at the edge of the crowd and a man who steps forward is exactly one decision. He decided. He caught up to the shape near the old stone well at the foot of the hill, and the lightning revealed the moment in absolute frozen clarity. Isra, soaked to the bone, her tunic torn, blood on her forearms, and in her arms a child. Marta, her face bruised, her breathing shallow, a rough bandage wrapped around her leg. Isra was not dragging her. She was cradling her, shielding her face from the rain with her own body, murmuring something low and rhythmic in a language Henrik did not recognize. She moved with the desperate, precise care of a creature who understood that the burden in her arms was the most valuable thing in the world. Henrik did not call out. He followed. He followed her past the well, up a game trail he'd never noticed, into a cleft in the hillside hidden behind a curtain of hanging ivy. A cave. And inside, lit by a single tallow candle, were the other 5 children. Willem, Tessa, Lynn, Pell, and the 5th, a girl named Celine. All of them alive. All of them clean, fed, wrapped in blankets that Henrik recognized. They were the same rough wool blankets that Alderman Thane had reported stolen from the orphanage stores a month ago. Isra set Marta down gently on a pallet of dry moss, and she straightened, and she saw Henrik standing at the mouth of the cave. Her copper eyes, the eyes the village called dead and hungry, were full of a thing that took Henrik a long second to recognize because he had never seen it on an orc face before. It was terror. Not for herself, for them. The children she had not stolen, the children she had rescued. And in that moment, with the storm howling outside and the candle flame bending sideways, Henrik understood that the monster in this story was not standing in front of him. The monster was wearing vestments and holding the only key. Isra took a step toward him. She did not raise a weapon. She raised her empty hands, palms out, the universal gesture of a creature asking to be believed. And Henrik, a farmer who had stood at the edge of crowds his whole life, opened his mouth to speak. But before he could, a horn sounded from the village below. The search party was forming, and Alderman Thane himself was leading it. The horn cut through the storm like a blade through wet canvas, and Henrik made the fastest decision of his life. He turned to Isra, who was still standing with her hands out, still asking to be believed. "Keep them quiet," he said. "No one comes out, no matter what you hear." She looked at him with those copper eyes, eyes that had seen a village carve a slur into her door, and she nodded. She did not ask if he would return. She did not ask if he believed her. She had learned, in 3 winters on that hill, that promises from humans were worth less than dry kindling. Henrik left the cave, pulled the ivy curtain back into place, and worked his way down the game trail through mud that swallowed his boots to the ankle. The horn sounded again, closer. The search party was assembling in the village square, and Henrik could see the torches from the tree line, a knot of orange light bobbing in the rain like a fever. By the time he reached the square, 50 people had gathered despite the downpour. Alderman Thane stood in the center on the mounting block outside the constabulary, his oil cloak dripping, his hands raised in the posture of a shepherd whose flock had been scattered by wolves. Constable Foss, a thin man with a weak chin and a stronger sense of self-preservation than justice, stood beside him holding a lantern. "The child, Marta, is missing," Thane was saying, his voice carrying over the thunder. "The 6th in 5 months. The orc has been seen near the orphanage on 3 separate nights. Her door is painted with the word we all know is true. And still we hesitate." A murmur went through the crowd. Someone shouted for burning pitch, another for hunting dogs. Henrik pushed through to the front. "I saw her," he said, and the crowd paused. 50 faces turned toward him, the farmer who rarely spoke, the man who stood at edges. Thane's expression flickered just for a moment, something cold moving behind the patient disappointment. "Saw her where?" Thane asked, carrying Marta toward the hill. The crowd began to roar, but Henrik raised his hand. "But she wasn't taking her. She was saving her. Marta was hurt. Isra was carrying her to shelter. The girl is alive." The silence that followed was the worst sound Henrik had ever heard. Not the silence of agreement or consideration, but the silence of a crowd deciding which version of reality it preferred. Thane stepped down from the mounting block. He approached Henrik slowly, with the measured weight of a man who understood that proximity to a heretic could be interpreted as contamination. "You saw the creature," Thane said quietly, "carrying a snatched child into the woods during a storm. And your conclusion was rescue?" His voice grew louder on the final word, pitched for the crowd, not for Henrik. "Our farmer friend has a soft heart," Thane announced to the square. "A soft heart, and perhaps a confused mind. The orc has been lurking for years. The children are gone. But he would have us believe the monster is a nursemaid." Laughter. Ugly, relieved laughter. The crowd had its narrative back. Henrik tried to speak again, but Constable Foss put a hand on his arm. "Go home, Kallstrom. You're overwrought." "I saw 5 other children," Henrik said, his voice low and steady. "Alive, in a cave. Willem, Tessa, Lynn, Pell, Celine, they're all alive." The names landed. He saw it. Several of the villagers, parents of the missing, those who had sat vigil in the parish hall, their faces changed. Confusion. The beginning of doubt. Thane saw it too. "The farmer has clearly been to the hill," he said smoothly. "Perhaps he has even met the creature. Perhaps he has eaten her food, shared her fire. Stockholm sympathies are not new in these borderlands. Constable, I will continue the search without interference. The creature is clearly not in her hut. She has fled into the woods with the last child. If we do not find her by dawn, Marta will never come back either." The crowd surged toward the hill. Henrik found himself pinned against the mounting block, watching 40 torches march into the rain toward Isra's hut, toward the tree line, toward the ivy curtain he had pulled closed 20 minutes ago. He had one advantage. They would search the hut first. They would find the blood on the doorframe. He'd seen the paint flaking, the raw wood beneath. They would find the empty hearth, the single cot, the shelf with dried herbs and a chipped mug. They would find nothing. The cave was well hidden. But Thane was not a fool. Thane had been running this operation for 5 months, and if he knew the children were missing from his own cellar, he would know soon enough that they hadn't been dragged away. They had been taken by someone who knew what he was. Henrik didn't go home. He went to St. Aldrich's orphanage. The building was dark, its stone walls slick with rain, the front door locked. Henrik had never been inside. The orphans were wards of the parish, their care funded by a grant from the regional diocese, and Alderman Thane maintained that the work required solitude and order. Visitors were discouraged. Henrik walked around the side, past the garden where the children had once grown turnips, past the empty goat shed, to the small timber door that led to the root cellar. The lock was heavy iron, but the wood of the frame was old. He found a broken hoe handle in the garden shed, wedged it into the jamb, and leaned his full weight against it. The frame splintered. The door swung open. The smell hit him first. Damp, rust, the faint sourness of unwashed bodies in a space with no windows. He descended 6 stone steps. The cellar was not a root cellar. It was a cell. 3 iron shackles bolted to the wall, the smallest of them sized for a child's wrist. A thin pallet of straw that had gone black with mold. A tin bucket in the corner, overflowing, and on a rough-hewn shelf beside the door, a leather strap, stiff with old blood, and an iron rod with a charred wooden handle, a branding iron. Henrik lifted it. The brand on the end was a small cross, exactly the kind of cross Thane wore around his neck on a silver chain. He searched the rest of the cellar. Behind a loose stone in the wall, he found a thin ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Not the official parish register he'd seen Thane present to the visiting bishop, a private book. He opened it. The handwriting was neat, precise, the record of a man who catalogued his sins like inventory. Willem, 3rd night, refused to recite, applied discipline, blood minimal. Tessa, 2nd week, cried for mother, applied silence, 2 days. Marta, 1st month, attempted to flee through the yard, brand applied. The entries went on. Children who had been beaten, starved, burned. Children who had been locked in this cellar until they learned what Thane wanted them to learn. That no one was coming. That the only authority that mattered was his. That the monster on the hill was a fiction he had built to keep the villagers looking outward while he destroyed their children in the dark. Henrik closed the ledger and tucked it inside his coat. The proof was here. But proof, he understood, was only as powerful as the person willing to read it. He went to the magistrate's house. The village council had a proper seal of authority, a man named Eamon Drew, whose job was to adjudicate disputes over property boundaries and stray livestock. He was not prepared for this. Henrik banged on his door until Drew opened it, blinking and holding a candle. He brought the ledger. He laid it on the table. He told Drew everything: the cave, the children, the brand, the cellar, the carefully constructed lie that had almost burned an innocent creature alive. Drew looked at the ledger. He looked at Henrik. He looked at the window, where the reflection of torches still flickered on the hill. "This is very serious," Drew said. "Yes, you need to call off the search. You need to arrest Thane." Drew closed the ledger. "These entries are not signed. The handwriting could be anyone's. And Thane is a man of the cloth, Henrik. A respected man. I cannot simply—" "Cannot?" Henrik's voice rose for the first time in years. "There are 6 children in a cave who are terrified of the man you call respected. There is a girl with a brand on her back, whose name is in that book. What would you call that?" Drew's face was a study in the particular cowardice of small-town officials who had built their careers on not making difficult decisions. "I will convene a hearing in the morning," he said, "when tempers have cooled, when the storm has passed. We can—" The door burst open. Constable Foss stood in the entrance, rain pouring from his hat. He was not alone. Behind him stood Thane, still in his oil cloak, calm, patient, disappointed. "I warned you, Constable," Thane said. "The farmer has been acting strangely, breaking into the orphanage, conspiring with the creature. Now he brings forged documents to the magistrate." Henrik turned. "The documents are real. The cellar is open. Go look. The shackles are still on the wall." Thane smiled. "The cellar door is broken by you. Anything inside could have been placed there. By you. To frame me!" The logic was a knot that tightened around Henrik, even as he saw how perfectly it worked. Thane had spent 5 years building an image that no one wanted to dismantle. The alternative, that a holy man had tortured orphans, was too heavy for the village to lift. Believing in a monster on the hill was easier. Believing that a farmer had lost his mind was easiest of all. "Take him to the lockup," Constable Foss said, his face a mask of relief at having the decision made for him. "We'll sort this out in the morning." 2 men seized Henrik's arms. The ledger was taken from his coat and placed on the magistrate's table, where Thane picked it up with 2 fingers, as if handling something diseased. "Burn this," Thane said. "We have enough darkness tonight without adding lies." And then, with the 2 men dragging Henrik toward the door, Thane said one more thing quietly to Constable Foss. "The creature is still out there, with the child. I recommend we expand the search to the hilltop, particularly the game trails. I noticed farm tracks leading up the eastern slope. Boot prints in the mud. Fresh." His gaze slid to Henrik. "My husband," Henrik said, and the words were pointless, and he knew it. "What husband has been for me," he said, "is the only man in this village who went looking for the truth, and I found it. And now you're going to burn the evidence while you hunt the innocent." He spent the night in a stone cell with a single barred window that showed the sky slowly clearing. The storm passed. Dawn came gray and cold. In the street outside, he could hear the renewed mustering of the search party. They had dogs now. Someone had woken the kennel master. The dogs would find the cave. Henrik sat with his back against the damp stone, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who had walked the contours of that hill for 43 years, that the children had less than 2 hours. Thane was leading the search. If Thane reached the cave first, there would be no rescue. There would be an accident, a cave-in, a fire. Thane would discover the bodies and mourn them publicly, and blame the orc, and the village would finally have its clean ending with no uncomfortable questions about the cellar. And the children, Willem with his refusal to recite, Tessa with her silent crying, Marta with the brand on her back, would become just more names in a ledger that had already been burned. Henrik pulled himself up. He studied the bars. He studied the lock. He was a farmer, not a thief. But he'd been fixing his own plow, and mending his own harness for decades, and a cell lock in a village constabulary was not a sophisticated mechanism. He worked the hinge pin with a piece of metal he pried from the cot frame, and when the pin slid free, the door swung outward with a grinding of rusted iron. The corridor was empty. The constable was out with the search party. Henrik walked out of the lockup and into the pale morning light. He could see the torches on the hill, winding up the game trail. He could hear the dogs baying. And he ran. Not toward the hill, the dogs were faster, and the mob was armed. He ran back to the orphanage, to the one thing Thane had not had time to remove. In the cellar, behind the loose stone where the ledger had been, he had seen a second object wrapped in oilcloth, a ring of keys. He had left them in the darkness when he heard footsteps above. Now he retrieved them, and he knew what they fit. The lock on the cellar door was not the only lock Thane used. The bolt hole in the back of the cellar, the one that led through a stone passage to the edge of the woods, was locked from the outside. That was how Thane had moved children in secret, from the orphanage to the woods, when he was ready to stage a disappearance. That passage led to the hill. He could get there before the dogs. He reached the cave just as the first shouts of the search party crested the ridge. Isra stood at the entrance, a heavy branch in her hands, her tusks bared, standing between the world and the children. She saw Henrik, and her expression did not change. She was ready to die here. "They'll be here in minutes," Henrik said. "The dogs." Isra said, "I know. I will slow them." "No. We end this now, all of it." He looked at the children, 6 faces, pale and still. The particular stillness of children who had learned that noise brought pain. Marta was awake now, her bandaged leg stretched in front of her, her eyes full of a knowledge no 8-year-old should carry. "I need you to be brave one more time," Henrik said to them. "I need you to tell the truth, together, in front of everyone. Can you do that?" Willem, the boy who had refused to recite, was the first to nod. Then Tessa. Then the brothers Lynn and Pell. Celine, who hadn't spoken since her rescue, reached out and took Isra's hand. Marta struggled to her feet, wincing at the leg. "He'll hurt us again," she whispered. "Not if we hurt him first," Henrik said, with the truth. The barking grew closer. Thane's voice, calm and carrying, echoed through the trees. "Spread out. The entrance is behind the ivy. I'll enter first. If the creature resists, you know what to do." Henrik looked at Isra. "You trust me?" She had no reason to trust anyone. She was 19 years old, alone in the world, with a scar that told a story she never offered to share. But she looked at the children, and she looked at the farmer who had come back. "Yes," she said, and they walked out of the cave together, the orc, the farmer, and 6 children who had been counted among the dead, into the blazing torchlight of a mob that had been promised a monster. The torches froze. 50 people, maybe more, standing in the gray dawn with dogs straining at their leashes and pitchforks raised, and every single one of them stopped cold. Because what they saw was not a monster dragging a victim. It was 6 children, filthy and hollow-eyed but alive, walking under their own power. And in front of them, not the creature they had come to kill, but a farmer who should have been locked in a cell. And the orc girl they had branded a kidnapper was holding the hand of a child who had been reported dead 4 months ago. Thane was at the front, his oil cloak still dripping, his face caught between the expression he had prepared for discovering a corpse and the expression required for discovering the opposite. He recovered quickly. "You see?" he called, turning to the crowd. "The farmer has been hiding them, colluding with the creature, keeping them in a cave while we—" "No." The voice was small, but it cut through the morning air like a blade. It was Willem, the boy who had refused to recite. He stepped forward, his chin up, his hands shaking. He didn't keep us. She saved us. From him. He pointed at Thane. Then Tessa stepped forward. Then Lynn and Pell, the brothers, each holding one of Isra's hands. Celine, still silent, raised her tunic. On her back, the burns. 3 of them. Small crosses, exactly the size and shape of the brand that Thane kept in the cellar. The crowd saw. The silence that followed was not the silence of a mob denied its prey. It was the silence of a village watching its entire understanding of the world reorganize itself. Constable Foss was there, his lantern still lit from the night search, his face pale. "What is the meaning of this?" he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He already knew. "The meaning," Henrik said, loud enough for everyone, "is that Alderman Thane has been torturing orphans in the cellar of St. Aldrich's for years. The missing children were never missing. They were running. From him. And Isra was the only one who took them in when they escaped." He pulled the ring of keys from his coat, the ones he had retrieved from the cellar. "These open the bolt hole that leads from the orphanage cellar to the woods. That's how he moved them. That's how he staged the disappearances." He threw the keys onto the ground at Thane's feet. "Open the cellar for them. Show them the shackles. Show them the branding iron with the cross on it. Show them the straw pallet that still has a child's blood on it." The crowd stirred. The dogs whined. Someone lowered a pitchfork. Thane did not pick up the keys. He laughed. The laugh was wrong, not dismissive. Something else. The laugh of a man who had been backed into a corner and had decided to burn the whole building down. "You think a ring of keys proves anything? You think these children, these ungrateful, lying wretches, are believable? They are orphans. They are nothing. I am the shepherd of this parish. I answer to the bishop. Who do you think a magistrate will believe?" That was when Magistrate Drew pushed through the crowd. He was out of breath, still in his nightshirt beneath his coat, holding something. The ledger. The one Thane had ordered burned. "I didn't burn it," Drew said, his voice thin but steady. "I read it. All of it. Every entry. Every date. Every child's name." He opened the book and began to read aloud. "Willem, 3rd night. Refused to recite. Applied discipline. Blood minimal." The crowd gasped. "Tessa, 2nd week. Cried for mother. Applied silence. 2 days." Another gasp. "Marta, 1st month. Attempted to flee through the yard. Brand applied." Marta, standing beside Isra, raised her chin. She pulled up the leg of her tunic to show the wound that Henrik had seen in the cave. The cross-shaped burn, still raw, still weeping. The crowd was no longer a mob. It was a jury, and the verdict was changing. Thane's face went through a series of transformations. First, the patient disappointment. Then, the cold rage. Then something simpler. Fear. He backed away. He looked at the 50 people who had marched up the hill to kill a monster and saw that the monster was now him. He turned to run, but the dogs were off their leashes. 2 of them caught him by the cloak and pulled him to the ground. The constable, finally finding his spine, put shackles on him, the same iron shackles that had been bolted to the cellar wall, brought up by someone from the crowd who had run back to the orphanage. Poetic, in a way. Dawn broke fully over the hill, and the light fell on a scene that no one present would ever forget. Isra stood among the children, still holding Marta's hand, still standing between them and the crowd. She had not spoken a single word. She did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had been said by the children she had saved. and the village, in the space of a single morning, had to confront the fact that the word carved into her door had been carved on the wrong home. But the story does not end there. A village that has been wrong for 3 winters does not simply apologize and move on. The children were taken to the healer's house for treatment. The cellar was documented by the magistrate. Thane was transported to the regional prison to await trial before the bishop's court, where he would eventually confess to 12 counts of abuse and be sentenced to the very silence he had imposed on his wards. And Isra? She returned to her hut on the hill. She did not come to the square for the celebration. She did not accept the offers of coin and bread and apologies that the villagers left at her doorstep. She stayed inside, because the village had done more than call her a monster. It had been ready to burn her alive, and trust, once burned, is not rebuilt in a day. Henrik went to see her on the 3rd morning. He found her outside, repairing the door where the word monster had been scraped away by someone, he did not know who. The wood was raw and pale. "They want to give you a medal," Henrik said. "They want to rename the parish hall. The children have been asking for you. Marta won't let the healer change her bandage unless you're in the room." Isra looked at him. Her copper eyes were the same, but something in them had shifted. Survival, perhaps, or the first tentative root of something that looked like hope. "Why did you follow me that night?" she asked. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly. Her voice was lower than he expected, rough from years of silence. "Because my wife told me once that the difference between a man who stands at the edge and a man who steps forward is one decision." Isra looked at the door. "I've been making that decision every day for 3 winters." "I know," Henrik said. "That's what I'm going to tell them. And that is where the final act begins. Not with the capture of a villain, but with the slow, difficult work of mending what was broken. The town, the children, and the orc girl who had been a monster only because the people needed one. The question now was whether the people could learn to live without a monster at all, and that answer would take longer than a single morning on a hill. The trial of Alderman Thane took place in the bishop's court at Thornhaven, a grey stone chamber that smelled of old incense and older secrets. The children did not have to testify in person. Magistrate Drew's ledger, the cellar shackles, and the branding iron were evidence enough. But 6 children chose to speak anyway. Willem, the boy who had refused to recite, stood in front of the bishop and recited the names of every child Thane had harmed. His voice steady, his eyes dry. Tessa described the 2 days of silence, how Thane had locked her in the dark until she forgot the sound of her own crying. Marta, still limping from the brand, pulled up her tunic without being asked and showed the court the cross-shaped scar on her leg. The bishop, an old man named Aldrich, the same name as the orphanage, a coincidence that unsettled many, listened with his hands folded over his chest. He did not interrupt. When the testimony was complete, he sentenced Thane to life in a monastery cell, a room with no key on the inside, where he would live out his years in the same silence he had imposed on his wards. It was not justice, not entirely, but it was the closest thing the law could offer. In Dunmire, the aftermath was quieter and more complicated. The villagers who had marched up the hill with torches and pitchforks returned to their homes with the taste of shame in their mouths. Some could not meet one another's eyes. Others, the ones who had been loudest in their accusations, began to slip out of town in the weeks that followed, unable to bear the weight of their own remembered words. The parish hall was not renamed for Isra. She refused that, flatly and finally. When a delegation of town elders came to her hut with the proposal, She opened the door only wide enough to show her face and said, "I did not do it for a name on a building." She closed the door. The elders stood on the steps for a long moment, and then Gammer Elspeth, the old woman Isra had once helped with firewood, said, "She's right. We don't get to buy our redemption with a plaque." The plaque was never made. The children, however, would not be refused. All 6 of them, once the healer had cleared them, walked up the hill to Isra's hut together. They brought a new door, not a symbol, not a gesture, a practical thing. Henrik had built it from seasoned oak, and the children had spent 3 days carving it. Not with words, but with images: a tree, a cave with 6 small figures inside, a hand holding a candle, a storm cloud breaking open to reveal the sun. They had carved it themselves, with chisels and knives that the village carpenter had taught them to use. When Isra opened the door, the old door, the one still raw where the slur had been scraped away, she saw them standing there, holding the new door between them, and she did something no one in Dunmire had ever seen. She wept. Not the quiet tears of relief, but the full-bodied, shaking sobs of a person who had been alone for 3 winters and had finally, against all evidence, been found. The new door was hung that afternoon. Henrik helped her set the hinges. The children watched from the grass, eating the berries that Isra had gathered from the high bushes. Marta, her leg bandaged but healing, sat with Isra's hand on her shoulder. The scar on Isra's face, the one that ran from temple to mouth, caught the afternoon light, and Marta asked quietly where it came from. Isra was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, and the answer was the final piece of a puzzle that no one in Dunmire had ever thought to assemble. "I was 8, she said, "the same age as you. I lived in a village far north, in the Rhinewood. My people were hunters, not warriors. We traded with the human towns. One winter, a group of bandits attacked the village. They targeted the children. To sell, to ransom, I don't know. I was hiding in a root cellar with 4 other children. One of them, a human girl named Ida, started to cry. The bandits heard. I ran out to draw them away. I led them into the woods, into the deep snow, for 3 hours. They caught me. The scar is from the blade of the man who caught me. But I heard later that the other children were safe. The village had time to hide them. Ida survived. She is alive now, somewhere in the eastern provinces. I did not think about being a hero. I thought about being a distraction." The children stared at her. Henrik stared at her. The story was not new in its shape, a sacrifice, a scar, but the detail that landed hardest was the age. 8. The same age as Marta. Isra had been a child herself when she made the decision that would mark her forever. And when she had seen children in danger in Dunmire, she had made the same decision again. Not out of instinct, but out of a pattern carved into her soul as deeply as the scar on her face. The monster, it turned out, had always been a protector. The village had simply never asked the right question. That revelation changed everything. Not immediately. Nothing in a small village changes immediately. But it planted a seed. The children, of course, already knew what Isra was. They had spent months in the cave with her, listening to her stories in the firelight, learning to read the weather from the way the birds shifted in the trees, learning that an orc's growl was not always a threat, sometimes a lullaby. They had known, and now the adults began to catch up. Mothers who had once pulled their children closer when Isra passed on the mill road started to let the distance remain. Merchants who had refused to sell her cloth or salt found themselves leaving small bundles at the edge of her property. With no note, as if the act of giving required anonymity to be bearable. The constable Foss resigned his post and moved to a different province. A new constable was elected, a woman named Huldah Stowe, who had been one of the few to stand at the back of the mob without a weapon. Her first official act was to request a formal review of the village's treatment of Isra. The review found no crime committed against the orc. Legally, the mob had not succeeded, but it did recommend that the village formally acknowledge its error. On the first day of spring, the village council passed a resolution. It read simply, "The village of Dunmire, having wrongfully accused the person known as Isra of monstrous acts, hereby acknowledges the harm done and pledges to remake this place as one where no outsider is condemned without evidence." Isra did not attend the vote, but Henrik brought her the paper afterward. She read it, nodded, and tucked it into the shelf beside her dried herbs. It was, she said, a good start. Henrik's farm changed too. He had always been a solitary man. Mari's death had turned the farm into a place of routine silence. But now, on most evenings, his kitchen had visitors. Willem and Lynn and Pell came to help with the barley harvest, insisting that Isra had said farmers should not work alone. Tessa and Celine came to study the carving of Isra's new door, and soon Henrik found himself teaching them to whittle, his hands remembering skills he had not used since he was a boy. Marta came almost every day, and she always brought Isra. The orc girl, no, the woman, for Isra was 20 now, her adolescence behind her, would sit at the table and peel vegetables or sharpen Henrik's tools while the children filled the room with noise. It was not the life Henrik had planned. It was louder, fuller, more chaotic, and it was better. The surprising detail that emerged from that season was not about Thane, or the cellar, or the brand. It was about the scar. One evening, as the spring light was fading and the first fireflies were appearing in the yard, a courier arrived from the eastern provinces. She carried a letter. It was addressed to Isra in a careful, old-fashioned script, and the seal was the crest of a merchant house in the city of Ashwater. Isra opened the letter, read it, and handed it to Henrik without speaking. The letter was from Ida, the human girl she had saved 20 years ago in the Rimewood. Ida had heard the story of Dunmire. It had traveled farther than anyone expected, and she had written to say that she was alive, that she had children of her own, and that she had never stopped wondering about the orc girl who had run into the snow to save her. "I have told my daughters about you," the letter said. "They know your name. They know your face. They sleep at night because a stranger chose to be brave." Isra did not reply to the letter right away. She sat with it for 3 days, reading and rereading. On the 4th day, she asked Henrik for a piece of his best paper and a quill. She wrote a letter of her own, short and direct, and at the end of it, she invited Ida to visit Dunmire. "The door is new," she wrote. "It opens easily." The courier took the letter east. 6 weeks later, a carriage arrived at the bottom of the hill, and a woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes the color of a winter sky stepped out. She walked up the hill alone. Isra met her at the door. They stood there for a long time, 2 women who had been children together in a moment of terror, separated for 2 decades, looking at each other as if the past had finally, mercifully, released its grip. Ida raised her hand and touched the scar on Isra's face, gently. "I thought about this every night," she said. "I thought about the sound of you running into the snow." Isra took her hand. "I thought about the silence after, hoping it meant you were safe." That evening, the children were gathered at Henrik's farm. Ida's daughters met them, and the noise level tripled. Henrik watched from the doorway as Isra stood in the center of the room, introduced as the person who had saved their mother. And for the first time since she had walked out of the northern forest, she looked not like an outsider, but like the root of something, a family, not by blood, but by the deeper tether of shared survival. The village of Dunmire had learned a hard lesson. It had learned that the monsters we fear are often the heroes we fail to see, and that the real monsters wear trust like a cloak. It had learned that words carved into a door can be scraped away, but the memory of them remains in the wood. And it had learned that redemption is not a single morning on a hill, but 1,000 small decisions made over years. Those decisions continued day by day, as the children grew and the seasons turned, and the orc girl who had once been called a monster became, simply, Isra, the woman on the hill, the protector, the friend, the truth. The story of Isra and Dunmire has no statue, no plaque, no renamed hall. What it has instead is a door that was carved not by craftsmen seeking payment, but by children who had been given back their lives. And on that door, if you walk up the hill today, you can still see the images: the tree, the cave, the candle, the breaking storm. Not a monument to a hero, but a monument to the truth that heroes are often hiding in plain sight, wearing the faces we have been taught to fear. The question that lingers is not what happened to Thane. He ended his days in a monastery cell, forgotten and silent. The question is, how many other Isras are out there? How many people branded as monsters because it is easier for a community to project its fear onto a stranger than to examine its own darkness? Every village has a hill on the outskirts, and on that hill there is almost always someone watching, waiting, protecting in ways the village cannot see. The difference is only whether someone like Henrik Karlström decides to step forward or stays at the edge of the crowd. Henrik himself lived to see the barley fields harvested for 10 more autumns. He never remarried, but his kitchen was never empty. The children he helped rescue grew into adults who carried his quiet example into their own lives. Marta became a healer, apprenticing in the same house where her burns had been treated. She always carried a small wooden horse carved by Henrik, a reminder that safe hands exist. Willem became a teacher, refusing to let any child in his care be silenced. And Isra remained on the hill, no longer an outcast, but a neighbor, a protector. A woman who had run into the snow once at 8 years old and had never stopped running toward danger to shield the innocent. If this story has stayed with you, it is because it asks something of us. It asks us to look at the doors we have carved words into, the labels we have painted on people we do not understand, the mobs we have joined because joining felt safer than questioning. And it asks whether we have the courage to be Henrik, to step out of the crowd and into the storm, not knowing if anyone will follow. Before you go, take 1 second to subscribe if you haven't already. It's free, and it tells us you want more stories like this. Stories of unlikely heroes, of hidden truths, of the moments when ordinary people choose to see clearly. Drop a comment and tell us. Who is someone you misjudged? We read every word. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that monsters are rarely what they appear, and that bravery wears many faces, even a scarred one waiting on a hill. Thank you for watching. Until next time.